Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Silviu Livescu. I'm a faculty in the Petroleum Engineering Department, and it's with great pleasure to introduce the next panel. The next panel is on geothermal energy, and the moderator today is going to be Dr. Ken Weisian. Ken is an associate director for the Bureau of Economic Geology and a retired U.S. Air Force Major General. At the Bureau, Ken is responsible for environmental related research. And so Ken and I are close collaborators. We just started the Hard Rock Geothermal Consortium. If any of you is interested to talk about geothermal energy or interested in collaborating, please contact any of us. And so for those of you who didn't have a chance to read the panel description from the website, geothermal energy is green baseload energy from the heat coming up through the crust of the earth, and has been used for heating for thousands of years and for producing electricity for more than 100 years. The US is the largest producer of geothermal electricity in the world at about 3 gigawatts. But our grid is so large that it represents less than 0.5% of our total power production. Growth in geothermal power has been slow since an initial boom in the second half of the 20th century, and that is changing now due to advances in multiple technologies, the majority from oil and gas, and the push to decarbonize. This panel is going to explore the total picture of the emerging geothermal anywhere paradigm. And with this, please welcome Ken and the distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Sylvia. Someone tell me where my slideshow is. Yep, there we go. It always wants to update the most opportunities. All right. Well, folks, as stated, I'm Ken Weisian. I'm with the Bureau of Economic Geology here at UT Austin, and I'm a geothermal geophysicist. This has been my focus area for 30 plus years. But for all but the last 3 or so, it's been a fairly flat-lined industry. Very slow growth, fairly mature industry. That really started to change a few years ago, and now is by orders of magnitude the most exciting time that geothermal energy has had in a long while, and that's what the panel will go into today. We've got an excellent and very diverse set of perspectives in the panel, plus one person who might join us midway who's over at the legislature right now. I'll explain more about that in a minute. But first, to get us all up to a basic level of understanding, because I think I'm fairly safe in assuming no one in the audience has a very deep geothermal knowledge. So I'm going to give you a drink from a fire hydrant, a very fast 101 on geothermal before we get into the actual panel work. So the Earth, the center of the Earth is about the same temperature as the surface of the sun, but it's a lot closer to us. And that plus radioactive decay in the crust and other parts generates a net outflow from Earth into space continually of about 47 terawatts. That's a pretty good chunk of energy, but it would be impossible to capture more than a small fraction of that. What really gets exciting is in the upper 10 kilometers of the crust, there's thousands of times our energy needs stored in accessible heat. That's an awful lot of energy that is tappable with technology that's kind of emerging and coming together right now. A little bit on nomenclature. When I'm talking geothermal systems for today, I'm not talking about a heat pump for your house. We're talking drilling typically 1 kilometer to 6 to 8 kilometers down in the ground and reaching temperatures on the order of 150 C or 300 F or higher, and using that heat to drive a turbine and generate electricity. All the installed world geothermal right now is what's called conventional. What that means is that you're tapping a natural hot water or steam system in the ground, and you're bringing those formation fluids up to the surface to drive your system. That's a fairly mature industry, and again, has had slow growth, at least in the US, some explosive growth in other parts of the world recently. What's really changing the picture now and driving the excitement is the geothermal anywhere idea. This is something that's only emerged in the last few years. You won't find a textbook on it. You won't find many publications on it. Most of what is happening is in the startup world. It's in conferences and such and forums like this. And one key point I want to mention that differentiate geothermal from the other leading renewables, namely wind and solar, is that geothermal is baseload. And that's a very big difference. It's 24/7. You can design your system even to be load following if you need to. And that's a major advantage for it. We'll get into other advantages in a minute. It has been slow growth, largely because it's very conventional geothermal systems are very geographically restricted. You have to go where Mother Nature concentrates the heat, and that means tectonically active zones. Think volcanoes, think the Ring of Fire, hotspots like Iceland, Hawaii, and such. And up until quite recently, you really couldn't get outside those zones because you can't find natural hot water systems at economical depths at the right temperatures. But with geothermal anywhere, the concept, you're not mining fluids, hot fluids in the ground. You're going after the heat that's in the rocks. And you're doing that by engineering your own fluid flow system, be it water or some other substance, that you circulate through the hot rocks to absorb the heat and bring it up to the surface. And that concept breaks that geographic paradigm of having to go to tectonically active areas and opens up essentially the whole world to geothermal production. It then becomes just a matter of the price point. And you can take this map, which is an actual heat map, and think of it as a relative ease of development map, with the red colors being easier, hotter rocks, the white colors being very relatively cool. But if your target is 150 C, you're not going to miss it. It's just a matter of how deep you have to drill, which in turn means how much is it going to cost. And what has been lowering that, I'll get to in the next slide, but we have geothermal projects brewing here in Texas. I don't have much time to get into them, but recently the Department of Defense has really jumped in the lead in this area with a project that we were part of, and Sage Geosystems, you'll hear from a little bit, we're part of, to do the design work for a 3 megawatt plant that would go on the south side of Houston, inside the Houston city limits, at a small field called Ellington Joint Reserve Base there. That is essentially waiting on the Department of Defense to figure out how to do the right kind of power purchase agreement. And then more recently, the Department of Defense issued a call for 4 prototype projects around the country, one of which, the only one in Texas, is Joint Base San Antonio. So potentially within a few years, you might see geothermal power plants turn on in Texas, which would be the first ones east of the Rockies. So why now? Why are we talking about it now? Well, it's been the convergence of multiple things coming together, again, just in the last few years. The biggest driver is oil and gas technology. Drilling faster, cheaper, more accurately, and all the supporting technologies that go with that. The oil and gas industry traditionally has had much bigger pots of research and development money than the geothermal industry, which has had a very, very thin margin consistently. The result being that oil and gas technology is anywhere from years to a decade ahead of what's being used in the geothermal world. You also have advances in the conversion of heat to electricity. For the first what, 80 years of geothermal. By the way, geothermal electricity production has been going for over a century in the world. The oldest plant in the US, the geysers, have been running since 1960, which gives you an indication of how long a well-managed geothermal system can run. But anyway, conversion of heat to electricity. Traditionally, water to steam go through your turbine. More recently, in the last few decades, a lot more organic Rankine cycle, or what's called binary systems. You use an intermediate fluid through a heat exchanger. And now the leading edge research is looking at supercritical CO2 as the fluid you cycle through your power system. Each of those is giving better efficiency of conversion at the lower temperature range. And then, of course, obviously, the desire expressed in many different ways to decarbonize. And all those come together now to generate this excitement. I will say before I go on, the leading edge of this work rests squarely in the startup world, with some support from the academic world. The ideas are being driven by a handful of startups, and the picture on this is going to clarify a lot in the next year or two. You know, right now we're at the prototyping stage. And no offense to anyone here, but everyone has good models. You can always have a good model. You've got to prove it. And we're at that stage now. Test drills have been going on for the past year. There'll be more over the next year. So over the next year or two, the picture's really going to clarify on what works or what doesn't. And if even one of these systems works, it's off to the races. And in fact, one of my secret delights is watching all those future energy predictions blow up, because none of them take into account geothermal energy, which has real potential to scale up fast if needed. I'm going to skip over what we've been doing. This says the Bureau, but really it's all of UT. UT is a real center of this, the academic support of this world. But one thing I will recommend to people, a recently completed 400-page study on everything geothermal in Texas, funded by the Mitchell Foundation. It's available on this website, both on the Energy Institute and the Mitchell Foundation. You can get to it real easily. It's a free download. It's all aspects of geothermal in Texas, not just the resource, but the policy, the law, the economics. It's looking at everything, and it should be a good reference work for people. It's done by, is over 24 authors in it. It was quite a year and a half of work. And I'll close my remarks by stating it's not just here. There's a lot of geothermal activity in the solar system. And as we move out, we'll need other sources of energy besides solar or carrying a big nuclear plant with you. So with that, I'm going to stop. And what I'd like to do now is ask, in sequence, we'll ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and give us about 5 minutes of their perspective on geothermal. Then I'll get into the panel moderation, and then we'll finish up with questions from the audience. So go ahead and be thinking of your zingers that you can ask when we get to that time. And I want to start off with Cindy Taff, the CEO of Sage Geosystems. Okay.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cindy Taff. I'm the CEO of Sage Geosystems. So I have a background in oil and gas. I was at Shell for over 35 years and left Shell at the end of 2020, and couldn't be more excited to be in geothermal. So when we looked over the fence, we saw huge opportunities in geothermal, but quite frankly, the cost is too high. So in our view, we need to drive the cost down so that geothermal is competitive with wind, solar, natural gas, and you want to be able to come to geothermal whether you believe in the climate crisis or not. We want to be the green energy that is the lowest cost. So I don't want to take away from what Ken has already presented, but right now, less than 1% of the utility generation consists of geothermal. So that's 16 gigawatts around the world. In the US, we have 4 gigawatts. So we are the largest producer of geothermal output or capacity. So that's fantastic. The reason why it's limited is, as Ken said, it's all conventional hydrothermal. So you have to place it, as Ken mentioned, near volcanoes, a ring of fire. because what you're doing is you're using that steam or that water that is close to surface to bring the heat to the surface, then to utilize that heat to generate electricity. So what we need to do as an industry is really crack the nut on hot, dry rock. And just going back to the other geothermal, that represents 1% of the geothermal resources around the world. So if we're able to crack the nut on hot, dry rock, so think about rock that is hot, but it doesn't have the permeability, it doesn't have the porosity, and it doesn't have those huge volumes of water to bring the heat to surface. So what you have to do is, as Ken mentioned, and I'm not going to duplicate Ken my whole presentation, is to create an artificial reservoir or tank in that rock by which you then pumps a fluid, we're using water, to bring that heat from the bottom of the well to the surface, and then you can use it to generate electricity. So that's the challenge of the geothermal industry right now in order to scale up, and not only to scale up, but scale up in geologic areas around the world, including in Texas, because we don't have any volcanoes in Texas. The DOE actually performed studies dating back to the 1970s, and it included along the Gulf Coast. They estimated that there's about 5 gigawatts of geothermal power in Texas. And think about it, that was in the 1970s. So the technology is now 50 years old. So our thought is that there's going to be pretty huge potential in Texas for geothermal. And there's a lot of companies actually looking at geothermal in Texas. So it's exciting times for Texas. One thing I want to introduce to the conversation is energy storage deep in the earth. You guys know wind and solar renewables have been installed over the last 15 years, so they're well ahead of any kind of renewable baseload installation. So the need for storage is really huge, and really the need for long duration storage, so something over 4 hours is a huge need. And so if you look at Bloomberg or Wood Mackenzie, they're actually predicting that need for storage to continue to grow for the next 5 to 10 years. So 5 to 15 years, I should say. So energy storage is really a huge need right now. And it's very complementary, again, to wind, solar, and even nuclear, because nuclear could use storage. I just want to mention just real quickly that this is a picture of operations that we have ongoing. This is Sage operations in Starr County, Texas. We have a vertical well with a single fracture where we are demonstrating what we call mechanical storage. So in that single fracture, we're pumping water, and that water is ballooning the fracture. And then when you shut the wellhead in, that water is being contained or held in that fracture under pressure. And then what we will do is flow it back. And it's amazing, the power of that fracture closing and jetting that water back to surface is just huge. So we've been doing this test for about 6 weeks. Our results have been so momentous that we're actually moving to a commercial demonstration as soon as we can get a high pressure turbine for this application. So we're very excited about that, but that's just a little bit more on the storage. This, I don't intend to go through every single I guess, diagram on this chart, but this chart represents the first week that we were in Starr County doing testing. And just two takeaways. One is that we were able to demonstrate that the duration that you can produce power is in direct proportion to the volume of water that you put in the fracture. So if you put 5,000 barrels in the fracture, for example, we were able to produce 200 kilowatts for 5 hours. When we put 20,000 barrels in the fracture, we were able to produce 200 kilowatts, so the same power for 17 hours. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to demonstrate. The other thing that we wanted to demonstrate was how quickly we could discharge the water out of the fracture. That's called C rate in a battery. And so if you're able to discharge very quickly, that means that you can meet those peak demands that Texas has, like during the summer when people get home, turn their air conditioner on, the peak demand is just huge. So we would be able to discharge that water and very quickly hit those peak demands. Let me see if I can play these as videos, maybe not. No, okay. The reason for these pictures is just to show the sheer power of the water that we had coming out of the fracture. So this is water, and this is only a portion of the water that's coming out of the fracture that we are, literally we pump the water of the fracture is closing on its own. And I wish I could play the video because the sound is pretty impressive. Ken, if you don't mind, if I can. I'm just gonna try this. Okay, so that's the water coming out of the fracture. That's literally the fracture just closing on its own, sending the water to the surface. And I mean, I've been in the oil and gas industry for a long time, and the sound is just impressive. These are our low pressure turbines. They weren't meant to create a lot of power. Here we go. But this is a very small stream of water that we had diverted out of the main flow to go through these turbines. So we were actually generating electricity. We had 7 shop fans that we were powering. So anyway, more to come on this. Like I said, we're moving to a demonstration plant in the next few months, or as quickly as we can get equipment. Just one thing to leave with, I guess, for people in the oil and gas industry that want to get into geothermal, this is the best segue of skills, the equipment. Geothermal is the way to go if you want to get into renewables. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you for your time.
Just want to point out how gracious it is of Cindy and Sage to share extremely current information. Y'all are the first public reception I know of this data, which is very significant data. Next, I'd like to introduce Merit Bromer, who is president of the International Geothermal Association, the international body that deals with geothermal. She has the best single person vantage point in the world of what's going on in geothermal, what the issues are, what the roadblocks are, and such. And so you have no slides, so please stay there.
And I hope you can hear me when I speak in the microphone. Is that okay? Yeah, perfect. First of all, good afternoon. Very nice to be here. And Ken, you invited me to come and speak on behalf of the international geothermal community. And thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's the first time in Austin, although I visited Houston when I was still within my oil career, but first time in Austin, and it's a grand place. So also congratulations to the university of embarking on a journey towards new energy, but still holding hands with the oil and gas industry. This is the future of energy, and I think we are embarking on a frontier. Couple of words about myself. I am a geologist by training, and I have a PhD in applied geophysics from the Delft University of Technology. I'm very Dutch, which is always when I am in the States that I'm overwhelmed with grandeur and your big buildings, your big plates, and your big cars. So it was a pleasure this morning to be picked up by a certain individual in his, what I call at least a big car. I joined the IGA a couple of years ago, now about 5 years, 6 years almost, time flies. And although everything that Ken and Cindy have been saying resonates very well with me coming from my oil and gas background, I would like to share some nuance and some shades of gray over the world of geothermal with you. We are operating these days in 75 countries. When I joined in 2017, no one heard of geothermal except in New Zealand and Iceland. In the traditional countries such as Kenya, which 40% of their electricity mix comes from geothermal. Iceland is geothermal hydropower. Costa Rica, 99% is renewable, out of it 60% is geothermal. We are dwarves, we are minute, I do appreciate all of that, but on the other hand, certain countries have really, really invested deeply, not only in their pockets when it comes down to money, but also in their resources, in sustainability, in environmental stewardship, and in skills to build geothermal. On the other hand, what I also see, and I really mean this, not to push geothermal to the forefront of the new energy mix, because I'm here with some people who are really are better than me in order to do that. But what I see as big change is that we need to heat up our buildings and our houses and cool them down in those summer times when it's awfully hot. And what I see with geothermal that is picking up speed and is really accelerating, especially in Europe and in China for that matter, is the investment coming both from oil and gas into district heating networks, thermal networks, whether that's space heating, some heat pumps and shallow geothermal, But also deep geothermal wells are being drilled in Munich since 15 years now. They had a vision. Munich is a southern city in Germany, and they had a vision of shying away from oil as their predominant fuel for heating up their houses and their industry. And that vision has resulted in a strategic development, not only from the utility company, which is public, but also to build skills and nourish the resources that they have, both from the geological subsurface, but also universities and building programs for people to embark on. They have now 75% covered with district heating in their cities. This is a city of about 2 million people, and it's just a grand effort in 15 years to build that knowledge, but also deploy the technologies. And that's the sedimentary basin. So I do take the points of volcanism and the ring of fire and all that to produce electricity, because that was always our weakest point when it comes down to geothermal. You need these high entropy zones, and hence it was very confined and site specific. But the need for heating and cooling has opened up already quite a significant part of our acceleration curve. And I just want to say that also China in this matter is one of the leading countries of shying away from coal as their basic fuel and adopting geothermal together with their national oil company, Sinopec. Third, a topic which is very close to my heart in the sense that I do believe in community energy, I do believe in ownership, and I do believe that geothermal has something to offer in that space. Whether we call it the global south or the developing world, but we have a duty to serve the bottom line of our society. Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America are those countries where people have no access to electricity. They have no access to clean water. They maybe even have a very poor, let's say, living standard in terms of living below the $1 a day. And I think if I look at what solar is doing really well is to providing them with a source of income through energy. And I would say geothermal can do the same. We have small modular, let's say, turbines. We're scaling up, let's say, the access of energy dimension within geothermal. Access to energy is one thing, but also the ability to utilize energy for instance, fish ponds, aquaculture, small greenhouses, coffee drying. All the major coffee producing countries are geothermal countries. Why not combine the two? Almost free energy coming from the earth and using that directly as a direct source of income for small scale applications. So with that, I would have liked to sort of open the wider appreciation of geothermal, which I think makes us unique. It makes us unique in the world of renewables. We still need the skills of fantastic startups like Cindy and your investment skills, you come to that, and the Bureau of Economic Geology to keep on pushing on the science behind it, because we haven't even covered 10% of what we know on planet Earth. Thank you.
And now we have Rayan Islam, who represents the investment side of geothermal. He's co-founder of 8090 Industries, has invested in multiple geothermal and renewable energy startups. With that, turn over to you, Rayan.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Well, first off, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. And also thanks to everyone who's involved with putting together Energy Week. See a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. Always great to be back here in Austin. So personally, my name is Rayan Islam, co-founder, general partner at 8090 Industries. So what is 8090? We have a rather unique origin story. And the really impetus behind this was we see a new industrial revolution underway. And it's shaped by the need to decarbonize every major industrial sector. And so when we think about agriculture, power, electricity, chemical manufacturing, steel, these are the hardest to abate sectors. And so we wanted to build a firm that reflected what needed to happen out on the field. So the unique thing here is we combine forces with 24 of the largest energy and industrial families from around the world. America's largest natural gas producer, America's largest steel manufacturer, chemical manufacturers, and brought them all together. And we can say, hey, let's lean into your expertise, your assets, and your holdings to accelerate the paths of breakthrough technologies that are decarbonizing major swaths of the industrial sector. What we like to say is, we're looking for today's Carnegies and Rockefellers, reimagine these sectors, but with breakthrough technologies and massive economic advantages out of the gate. So with that, we've covered everything from nuclear. So we've invested in nuclear companies that can also recycle spent fuel, synthetic biology, and geothermal. So why geothermal? Personally, I grew up in Texas, but also my family is originally from Bangladesh. And anyone here from a developing country, this is probably an experience you've experienced before, which is watching power going out 6-10 times a day in Dhaka. That was my experience. And so there was a very deep, intimate understanding of energy security being a challenge and infrastructure that's lacking. And so today, by 2050, we'll have 10 billion people on the planet. So 7 billion people, basically half of the global population will be added to the global population. And that means we need a lot more power. And that power is going to come from a large part from the developing world. And so while solar and wind is amazing, we need a source of true baseload renewable power. And it's hard to get that without two core kind of additions to the energy transition. And it's interesting, well, a lot of people think about energy transition. We also think about what's the energy addition. And so that's where we spend a lot of our time on nuclear on one end and geothermal. So on geothermal, our thesis when it comes to investing in startups is we're big students of history here. So the best equivalent analogy is what Howard Hughes Sr. or George P. Mitchell, who helped fund a lot of what we're doing here today. And we attribute a lot of their kind of know-how and pioneering capability to what's being done now in geothermal, including what Sage is doing. And that is, we need to encourage new wildcatting-like behavior, but we don't have the tools yet, right? So if you go back to Howard Hughes Sr., pioneered the drill bit, and all of a sudden, it democratized access to a fundamental technology that allowed for exploration. And a normal person could go out there and say, hey, I'll rent this drill bit and go out to the field and look for oil. And same with George P. Mitchell when it came to fracking. In geothermal, the interests are aligned where you have large corporates, oftentimes publicly traded, who have no incentive to go out there and be this wildcatting behavior. They're not explorers. They're managing business as usual, managing existing assets, reporting to a board. And so how do you encourage that kind of swashbuckling entrepreneurial spirit in geothermal? And that's what the important work that's being done, as Ken so eloquently put, that's being pioneered by startups today. And so we have one investment and we have a few more we're about to announce here on the geothermal end. And one's called Quays. And Quays is, when we think about geothermal, you have enhanced geothermal systems. Basically take what you learned from fracking and applying it, both to technology and equipment and assets, but applying it to geothermal. But then there's another kind of new technology we can bring to the table, which is millimeter wave technology. And put simply, how do you decouple geographic challenges and geology challenges from the equation? So today, if you want to uncover true supercritical heat, you want to be able to drill deeper. And unfortunately, we just don't have the technology to go upwards of 12 kilometers deep. The largest and deepest drill has ever been done before is in Kola in Russia. It's an Arctic Circle. It was basically 12 kilometers deep, but it took 20 years to drill that. So how do we apply that to today? And so we're very excited to back Quays, pioneered by the MIT Fusion Center. And basically it's millimeter wave technology. It's a cousin to microwaves, but with much higher frequencies. Put simply, it can vaporize hard rock, including basalt. So starting out, the plan is you do conventional drilling up to 2-3 kilometers deep, and then you bring a gyrotron, which is this megawatt gyrotron that actually beams these millimeter wave technology and incorporates or almost kind of simulates the casing because of how hot that millimeter technology is. And that's where you can get the depths that you can actually get to, where now you can unlock upwards of 550 degrees Celsius, supercritical heat, enabling industrial manufacturing like chemicals, cement, and steel. But that's kind of like a high level of how we think about things, and we have others we're looking into. But very excited to be here, and thanks again for hearing me out.
Thank you. You'll notice we've got an empty seat. We've had another member of the panel scheduled who still might show up. But as an associate of mine, Malcolm Ross, told me yesterday, he has this theory of calendar gravity, where when you have a major event, then it sucks in other things near it. Well, there's several bills related to geothermal energy that are being considered by the Texas legislature. It's supposed to have been last week. It's right now. And a couple of us were supposed to testify. We prioritized this, but we had to, but Barry has a duty to that. But let me fill you in a little bit on Barry's background. Barry Smitherman, he's law professor here, but he's also former public utility commissioner, former railroad commissioner, and now is the president of the Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, which formed up less than a year ago, but already has essentially every major player and startup in the area and nationally and internationally involved in it. And one of the things that they're hoping to do, they have two main goals: education, which goes to some of the things that have been pointed out here already today, and some of the legislative activity. So there's three things that are being addressed by the legislature. Hopefully it will resolve, but I make no predictions in the political world. The first is, who owns the heat? It was already mentioned on like gold and minerals. Same thing applies to heat. Well, if you're pumping water out of the ground that's hot, that may be one thing. But what if you're mining the heat in the rocks? Is it water rights? Is it surface owner? Is it minerals? Hopefully that will get clarified by the legislature this round and remove one of the biggest obstacles to development in Texas right now. I know on my projects that I've focused on have had clear single owner, no question. In other words, the military who owns everything on a base and below it. But it's an issue. Another one is who regulates the wells. So it turns out that, at least by interpretation right now, if you have an injection and extraction well for geothermal system, the injection well is TCEQ, Texas Environmental Quality Commission. The other well is Railroad Commission. So there's a proposal to make it all into the Railroad Commission, who kind of is used to working energy issues. And then there was one more, oh yes, one more, adopting abandoned wells. We may get to that in a little bit. You know, what can you do with old oil and gas wells? Well, right now there's a law that makes it very easy for an oil or gas company to take over an abandoned well. It's a win-win for everybody. Unfortunately, the law actually says something to the extent of oil and gas. So the tweak there is in geothermal companies or operators and such. So he's actively engaged in that. I would urge you to just Google Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, see what their activities are on that regard. A couple of other things, hearing people talk, sometimes we take it for granted some of the basic knowledge on this. I want to hit a few quick points that I missed earlier. One is traditional hydrothermal geothermal systems are typically significantly less carbon emission than natural gas power. They're not zero, but they're way less. These new geothermal anywhere systems, by definition, are closed or semi-closed. They truly are zero carbon emissions on production, negating, you know, how much concrete you have to use and that kind of stuff to build it, but zero to operate it. Another important thing to keep in mind is that for the medium to low temperature wells, a surprisingly robust order of magnitude estimate of what you can get out of any well is about 3 megawatts from a good geothermal well. We mentioned scaling up earlier. During the height of the Texas shale frack boom, we were drilling in Texas alone 15,000 wells a year. That is what I use in my head to think of, well, how quickly could you scale up geothermal? Almost no limit on that. Probably the limit is making the turbines, in my estimation. But I would love to find out what the bottleneck is to producing 15,000 geothermal power plants a year. So that's it with those questions, with a little bit of catch up. Now I'm going to go into panel questions. And again, we will get to audience questions also. So be warming those up. I'd like to lead off to Merritt, who again, and by the way, just came here from Mexico, Geothermal Energy Association meeting. What is the perception versus the reality of geothermal energy compared to other sources of energy, like wind and solar, nuclear, or oil and gas? What do you see across the world? Does it vary, or what's the dominant theme?
Yes, it's a very good question, and one observation is, of course, it depends who you ask. So I guess the the traditional way of looking at geothermal, if you speak to people from, for instance, in countries where geothermal is part of their, let's say, their DNA, their culture, to again go to countries like New Zealand, Hungary in Europe, by the way, has also an embracing attitude towards geothermal. Iceland is always mentioned as one of the leading examples for geothermal, but they live with nature and hence the heat beneath their feet, as they call it, it's part of their DNA, it's part of their culture, it's part of their indigenous knowledge. And hence there is a huge sympathy for the energy called geothermal. Now, in the more emerging countries and in those sometimes even with an oil and gas track record, there is mixed feelings. I mean, I come to conferences, events when everyone is technical and everyone is interested in those technical, beautiful pictures and how a well operates and this and that and the other. You will find no one who says, oh no, that's scary, or I don't like the emissions, or my goodness, I don't want to be involved in geothermal. But I also happen to be engaging with, as part of my role, of course, with politicians, with the local public, with audiences who are not necessarily educated around energy in general, and definitely not in the subsurface and hence geothermal specifically. And I've seen signs that says frack off. I've seen signs, no geothermal in my country. I've seen signs that says, I do not want to be associated whatsoever with geothermal because you're digging a hole in the ground and you're like oil and gas. And hence, I think, again, it depends on who you ask, but I think we have a long way to go to making geothermal mainstream. I think we have a long way to go to either be known for our green and clean image, because one of the big, let's say, impressions that certain, let's say, naysayers have with geothermals, they look at our, I think they're beautiful power plants, and they see the steam coming out of our pipes, and they say, you see, you are polluting. And again, it's all about education, and we agree that we're doing something right. We agree that we're using our skills and technologies and best practices and standards, but I think there is a world to win out there who is not educated. And hence the perception of geothermal is still seen as something that could do well, it could have a role, but as we saw as well with the BP outlook that Matt put up on front, we are not mentioned as energy forecast by 2060. And part of that is perception, part of that is good branding, but part of that is all of us working together and being very effective in our voicing as well towards geothermal energy and what it means.
In forums like this, so everyone has a duty to go
Yes.
spread the word. Do any of either of the other panelists want to comment on the perceptions versus reality?
I'll just make a comment about fracturing. So we are very transparent in what we're doing. You know, we do use the 4-letter word fracturing because we're putting a crack in the rock. However, we've talked to entities like in Germany, and they look at what we're doing and they say, that's actually stimulation, it's not fracturing. And we're not using proppant, we're not using high pressure pumps like the oil and gas industry, so we can actually fracture with a rig pump. And then we just recently joined a company for a DOE FOA in California, and they said they've already talked to the California entities where they said fracturing is banned for oil and gas, but for geothermal, fracturing is not banned. So, again, we're trying to be very transparent. With Ken's group, we're actually measuring induced seismicity on all of our projects, whether we think we're going to have it or not, because we also want to be very transparent that, we aren't having it. And so it's a good policy to be able to measure it, show the communities.
Yeah.
And that data we collect, we have a network around their test site, goes right to the public website for our induced seismicity network for the state.
Yeah.
Right?
And I just say from a public perception and reality thing, I'd just make a comment on labor and talent. And it's interesting, the entire geothermal industry in the United States is only about 4,500 people. Petroleum engineers, just petroleum engineers in Texas is upwards of 14,000 people just in Texas. And you think about the energy transition and young talent that really wants to work in the energy industry, but says, hey, I don't want to work in fossil fuels. You have an amazing opportunity to take that know-how, the same capabilities are incredibly relevant, retool it and apply it to an emerging new industry. So I would think that's also really exciting because that's really, shaped by the next generation and thousands potentially of talent entering that workforce.
Thank you. I'm interested in one of the things I'm interested in is the potential of geothermal to level out wind and solar production, dump the excess zero selling price energy into the ground, bring it back out later. To that extent, Cindy, first, can you talk about, even in ballpark figures, what's the efficiency of your energy retrieval versus energy in your test wells and your modeling?
So yeah, so what Ken's talking about is this energy storage that I just showed you the pictures on. So we have two components. One we call mechanical. And so what that is using is the pressure energy of the water that you put in the fracture. There is a heat component, and you may have seen it in the video where there was some steam coming off the water. But in the mechanical storage, the heat component is not enough to justify putting additional power plant equipment to actually turn the heat into electricity. So we do use heat, as Merritt is suggesting, for other applications. So the efficiency of that system, we're estimating to be between 70 and 85%. Now, why such a big range? We're usually conservative. So we started out at 70, but during the last 4 weeks or 5 weeks that we've done this testing, we've actually been able to measure the efficiency of the downhole part of the system, and we've gotten about 95%. It's by no means going to be 95% because we don't have the efficiency of the power plant system. So once we get the power plant system on location, then we can measure the whole system efficiency. So I would just say 70 to 85%. Lithium-ion batteries are about 85%. Now, if we're able to drill these wells to a depth where we can get that heat and actually justify putting the equipment on the surface to harvest that heat, our models show that at a bottom hole temperature of 200 degrees C, then the efficiency is going to be 200%. So what does that mean? That means we're not only storing pressure energy, but we are generating new energy in the form of heat. As that water is being stored in the fracture, it's also being heated by the earth. And so again, 200 degrees C, then the efficiency is about 200%.
So it makes for some interesting prospects of scaling up energy storage while avoiding massive lithium battery banks, I think. Brand, what is the investing picture like for geothermal energy right now? Not just your company, but the whole picture.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I slightly touched on earlier, but we're seeing brilliant new pioneers like yourself mobilizing these new systems to the table, enhanced geothermal systems and others. And over the next couple of years, we're starting to see the data points out in the field. How do they work? How do they function? How well are they performing? How efficient are they? And then you can prove and point to, hey, look, I have a field asset. Here's the efficiency. Here's how much output I'm getting, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this right now is really funded largely by venture capital. And I think that's incredibly powerful. But at the same time, you're already seeing incumbents from industry investing along the way. So Neighbors Drilling from the rig side, or Chevron or Chesapeake. And everyone's kind of mobilizing and trying to look and say, who's going to win out and who's going to be successful. After this, the next stage is really getting out more commercial assets on the ground. But after that, then it gets really exciting because then developers enter the picture, just like in solar and wind. And obviously, if you look back across solar and wind, even over the last 15, 20 years, who won out? Not really the technology companies per se, although there's big winners there, but developers like NextEra, which is America's largest renewable power producer as a developer. And so that know-how will be incredibly important. And that's kind of how I see this over the next 10 years or so. But it's really exciting, and we're going to get those data points really quickly here. So it's the perfect time to be in this space.
Let me follow up just a little bit and drill into what are the critical tells for you to make a decision? What are those key little bits that get you over the hump to say, yes, we'll invest in this idea?
Yeah. So in geothermal, there's a couple of areas. So you have residential, you have commercial, like buildings, you have industrial assets, and then utility scale geothermal systems. And then there's different companies addressing different one of those categories. What we look for is someone that has an interesting, unique proposition from a technology perspective that hasn't been tried before, because frankly, all this stuff is new. But covering a new area and a new approach. But it's proven to some extent, to the extent that you can. whether that's a lab level or some type of demonstration. Afterwards is, do you have a serious incumbent or, corporate who stepped forward and said, hey, I can see how this moves forward. I've done a techno-economic analysis and I'd love to come involved along with you. And you'll see that as well along the way. But that's kind of how we're thinking about it. Again, there's an ecosystem where you're bringing best-in-class fracking techniques and equipment and technology to the table. And there's also completely bold new possibilities as well that people are just reimagining. Both have a role to play. And so we're kind of monitoring all of them along the way.
Okay. I'm going to toss the next question first to Merritt, but I'd like inputs from everybody on this. What do you see as the greatest risk to geothermal taking off?
Worldwide?
Yes.
Yes, okay,
Yes.
yeah. I think the social acceptance of utilizing our resources. I think it's the biggest threat. And with that, I do mean the connect with elected professionals who either are the decision makers by passing bills, as I saw this morning, because I was invited to go to your capital and I've seen how passing bills work here. And it is not easy to pass a bill on geothermal, neither is that going to be anywhere on this, let's say, on this planet. So yes, Ken, let's go to the moon and do some lunar thermal there. No, but with social acceptance, it comes from multiple dimensions, I guess. It's because I have no doubt that from a technology point of view, we can deliver, whether it's clays or sage or whether it is, there's still conventional hydrothermal players who are going to go bolder with their investments, and I see the whole of East Africa that still can be tapped with the conventional, let's say, hydrothermal approach. So for me, it's not about that. I don't see that as the biggest risk for geothermal to take off. I see a lack of trust towards subsurface generated energy. And that is not to criticize my own background as well within the hydrocarbon industry, but the extractive industry is a difficult industry for people who either make laws, pass bills on it, to educate upon. And it's a selected group of people that understand really well how to manage subsurface critical issues. And hence, when we're not training our people to be both excellent subsurface professionals, but also wonderful communicators who can not only go to the capital and make the bill go past, but also explain to their family members how wonderful the extractive industry in general is, I think we will have a huge problem with getting the social acceptance for our licenses to operate.
Cindy?
Yeah, I think it's actually cost and the geographic reach of the current geothermal technologies. I think if we can make it cost effective, we can do it in more places than where geothermal is installed right now. I agree with Merritt, there are social challenges, but if we can scale up and show that it's clean, we can do it safely, and communities love it, then I think we can eventually break down the barriers that Merritt is talking about.
Now, I'll just inject, one of the really great situations for geothermal is remote, underserved, and island communities. Islands, if you live on an island, you are paying through the nose to import oil or whatever hydrocarbon you need. And the potential to have your energy source right underneath you, or in remote areas of Alaska, the colonias in South Texas. That gets me excited about helping people out. Do you have an addition on this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of them hit it on the nail. It's one thing is a storytelling problem. And how do you storytell this in a way where it's branded as this beautiful thing like Tesla, right? And when people look at it and say, hey, this is inspiring, this is something that we want to champion. It's patriotism in a way, because you're actually leveraging your existing assets and your land. I think that's one angle of it that could be improved upon. And then showing how the largest institutions and oil and gas and energy operators can make a ton of money off of it. And again, it comes down to cost, repeatability, showing that this can be systematic and it can be a plug and play solution. And so we're going to get those data points very quickly, but that is really what it kind of will be the current bottlenecks, but once alleviated, open up the floodgate.
We probably have time for one more question with hopefully a fairly short answer if that's possible, but what has been the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits on this field? And I'll toss it first to you, Ray.
I mean, the IRA is an incredible piece of legislation, both for residential and for commercial. So in residential, and you already have a 30% production credit on residential. And so we're going to see a lot of momentum, just like in the early days of solar for homes and Solar City. So we're already seeing companies doing that, and pretty relatively straightforward of how you adopt it at the home. And you already see those costs and emissions and efficiencies numbers make really great sense. And on the commercial end, you're going to see that too. So it's incredible legislation. We're going to see a lot of momentum from it. So we're excited, and it only is a boon to the industry.
What's your perspective from the startup side?
It has exploded the business case for both geothermal and storage. So geothermal gets a investment tax credit. There's stackable additional credits for underserved communities, whether you're in an energy community, and those stackables can bring you up to 60% in some areas, and quite a few areas of Texas, because a lot of areas of Texas are energy communities. On the storage side, you have both the ITC and the PTC piece, investment tax credit and production tax credit. So it's a great bill. It goes for 10 years. What I will say is that, you need to get started in order to start getting the tax credit. So, but yeah, it's great piece of legislation that's helped or will help both storage and geothermal. Great.
Okay. I want to close with a little bit of a thought here. Most people in here are old enough to have this time span, but obviously, well, none of us are old enough to know about the original Texas oil boom, but Texas really led the nation in multiple hydrocarbon revolutions. Where are we now in wind? Texas shot into the lead in the nation in total wind production. I think we're going to lead the nation this year, next year in total solar energy production. Texas has all the ingredients to lead the world and the country in this revolution of geothermal energy. It is really exciting. And with that, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. Let's have some good ones. Good, I see a lot of hands, which tells me we probably won't even get to them all.
Questions? Cindy, are you using potable water to inject into the wells? And how are you recycling your water?
Yeah, so we are using a water source well on the site of location. It's drilled to about 350 feet, to get the water source, the source of water. We're storing the water, and so we are reusing the water. We realize that we're going to have to make up for, evaporation, but we're largely reusing the water. The interesting thing about the water too is that as we pump it in the fracture and flow it back, pump it in, flow it back, we've noticed, and this wasn't a focus, but the water cleans up over time, which was kind of surprising to us. There was one point where we were doing a 650 kilowatt test, so we're really surging the well, and so we got a few fines, but after that, the water just cleaned up over time, visibly cleaned up. We're going to get it tested, but it was quite interesting. So we have a water storage, a surface water storage facility as well.
Okay, we'll alternate back and forth. Sir?
I'll be quick. So knowing that the biggest kind of conundrum with geothermal is location, what are your thoughts on supporting transmission lines? And then my follow-up question is Hawaii, why aren't you there? It's 50 cents per kilowatt. That would be the #1 place. And if you want to send me, I'm willing to go.
Yeah, no, so let me start with the first one, the transmission lines. I think what you're suggesting is why aren't we drilling close to transmission lines? Yeah, I mean, that makes the most sense. unless you're doing a microgrid like Ken mentioned, we're working on for the military, or doing an island grid for an industrial application. But you're spot on. The shorter you can make that distance to connect, you're going to save money. I think the rule of thumb is $1 million per mile for interconnection. Okay, so, and then Hawaii, I mean, yeah, I'd love to hire you to go to Hawaii for us. I mean, Hawaii is more conventional geothermal. I think Hawaii, I mean, I'm not real familiar with Hawaii. My feeling is they've been doing geothermal in Hawaii for quite a while, or so I'm sure that's something that, I know we were contacted by a company to look at Hawaii, and it kind of died down, but our view was that seemed to be more conventional, at least for stage, more conventional. Now, with that being said, we're actually working with companies that have conventional hydrothermal wells, and we're working with them, as you can imagine, if they drill it and they don't produce the high volumes of water that they need, well, then it's a dry hole. And so we can use our technologies to make those wells commercial. So we're working with companies in Hungary and in Japan to repurpose their oil and gas, their geothermal wells to, with our technologies. And so what the advantage of those wells is, they're hot already and the casing size are usually huge. So there might be an opportunity for repurposing wells in Hawaii if there's dry holes.
I'll add a little bit to that. Another new thing I would say about geothermal, it's a little more distributed. It's going to be somewhere between, a gigawatt scale nuclear plant and rooftop solar. Why? Because that energy density when you're doing geothermal anywhere is not that high. You're not going to get a gigawatt out of the same footprint as a nuclear plant. You're going to get maybe 50 megawatts. But the other, what are we saying? We're saying geothermal anywhere. You can site it where you need it and eliminate essentially the transmission distance. Again, that was a key aspect of military bases. Drill it right in the center of the base and then distribute it in a microgrid. Now that won't be applicable everywhere, but drill next to industrial centers or in them and put the electricity use right there. And then, by the way, something we didn't get into very deeply, what's our biggest electric draw in Texas in the summer? Air conditioning. It's actually a lot more efficient to directly use the heat for heating and cooling than it is to produce electricity. But regardless of what you can do, you always have a last stage of heat, and you can always use that waste heat for direct use in all the various things that Merritt talked about. So different ways of thinking, different needs for city planning if this takes off. How do you incorporate this as your city expands? How do you design your grid for this in-between distribution of power sources? A lot of great research topics. Where are we? We're over here.
Yeah, no, thanks. Really great talk. I really appreciate it. Very informative. A couple questions. One, Cindy, you said one of the barriers to geothermal taking off is the cost. So what is the cost, say, per kilowatt hour? It'd be interesting to hear that. Secondly, maybe this is for Ken or anybody else. Is there any unintended circumstances yet, that consequences that we might think of, like if you're pulling heat out of the ground, does the surface of the ground get cooler and all of a sudden, plants? I have no idea. I'm just asking. And then thirdly, I see so many similarities in skill set with the oil and gas industry. Have you partnered? Have you tried to partner? Is the oil and gas industry interested in partnering with you? The skill set is so amazingly similar, right? Drilling holes in the ground, heat transfer, whatever. Those are all the things that you would think that there'd be a lot of synergies there. So hopefully not too many questions, but.
So I'll start with the cost. So we use something called levelized cost of energy, LCOE. If you look at geothermal right now, it's in the, I would say, $50 to $70 per megawatt range. And then if you compare that to solar and wind, which is probably about half of that. So that's our target, is to drive the cost down to at least be competitive with solar and wind. And they're not base load, but we also want to be competitive with natural gas and coal. And so, and we think, as Ken said, there's a drilling revolution because you're getting 3 megawatts per well. That's going to happen. So because of our oil and gas background, the skills that I was actually vice president over unconventional wells at Shell. My team, they were able to remove 50% of the cost over a 5-year period while the the lateral lengths are getting longer and the number of fractures is getting, higher. So I'm convinced that the oil and gas industry can help in that manner. And then to your third question, on partnering with oil and gas companies. So yes, we've definitely, one of our investors is Neighbors, and Neighbors is the largest, onshore drilling contractor in the world. They've got a worldwide footprint. They've been great to work with. We've talked to different oil and gas operators, from the large ones, the Shells, the Chevrons, the BPs, to the smaller ones, Chesapeake, Murphy, and they're all at a different place on interest. I think the larger ones are still trying to figure out what they want to do, and then the smaller ones, what I found is that there's usually a person in the company that's kind of a catalyst. In fact, I know one of them sitting in the audience right here, Nick, and they're a catalyst, and if they do homework on the weekends and at nights, and then if they can get some higher level manager to take interest, then it seems to take off, right? But yeah, so I think they're still watching it closely. I think they're quite interested, but yeah, the natural segue of the skills and the equipment, and it just seems like a no-brainer.
On the unintended consequences aspect, you can manage the consequences. They're pretty small, most likely, like the thermal contraction, because you're cooling rocks down. Depending on how you manage it, you may, for instance, the cool down zone around a heat extraction well may be 100, 200 meters. And you may use that for like 20 years until the temperature drops 10%, then switch over to this one or drill a new one. It can be managed. One of the other main concerns that gets voiced a lot, besides induced seismicity, is, well, what are you going to do to our water sources? And that's a mature best practice part of drilling wells. We drill, well, like I said, up to 15,000 wells a year, most of which go right through aquifer zones and below them. They're standard best practices for, cementing and grouting a well, how to isolate it so that you don't get leaks. Now, if you don't follow them, you have problems, but that's established best practice. And those are the main concerns that most people have, beyond just, some folks just will react negatively to anything. Anything from the panel on any of those three questions?
Well, maybe on the training, yeah, we do a lot of training as well worldwide, and we see a lot of oil and gas companies are taking an interest. I think it's a logical transfer, not biased at all, but I think it's the only technology, as Cindy said as well, that let's say, our entire subsurface professionals coming from the hydrocarbon industry is not only suitable for, but also interested in. So I see a lot of interest coming from oil and gas, but I also see enough, let's say, gaps that still need to be filled. And hence, I think it's exciting to also work with universities and university programs and building more, like say, stronger geothermal masters, for instance. And because now it's still a little bit fragmented all over the world where people get their training on, and hence it's not standardized, and hence knowledge is still very dispersed. So one of the things that would be nice for UT as well, when they are now developing not only fantastic startups, but also to work more jointly with oil and gas and the geothermal community to build these strong master programs or PhDs or those kind of training programs. Good question.
A little bit of follow-up on that. You heard how small the total US geothermal community is. There are only a handful of academic institutions that really do geothermal. Now, there's starting to be a rapid increase because people are smelling potential funding, but that amount is pretty small. And I've been part of a couple of classes that are meeting a very high, well, they're not meeting a very high demand from the oil and gas industry to learn geothermal for potential cross flow and cross training. That demand signal is really high. Sylvia taught the first geothermal engineering class, at least in corporate memory, here at UT last year. I co-taught the first geoscience-based geothermal class. So we're moving in that direction to meet the demand. Sir.
First off, thank you all for being here. and sharing your expertise with us. A really important conversation. I know y'all mentioned the distinction between the energy transition and energy addition, which I really appreciate the distinction. I think parallels some of what Matt Gallagher was talking about in water, where they're looking for an alternative water supply and produced water. And so in that vein, I wanted to ask y'all your take on how traditional power generators, from fossil fuel fired power generators and coal or natural gas combined cycle, can take advantage of the opportunity and enhance geothermal systems to diversify their power generation at their plants, or to capture some of the energy demand from carbon capture technologies and other ways to clean up their energy footprint.
Anyone?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing quite a bit of that momentum already. Neighbors being one, they're invested in both of our companies actually. Outside of that, sorry, this is there's been a lot of momentum also from tech companies, interestingly enough. So Google, Microsoft, Amazon are procuring a lot of the renewable power, at least from a project pipeline perspective, from next generation geothermal systems. One company called Fervo Energy is actually based in Houston, and they're working to basically provide geothermal power for an entire data center cluster for Google. And so if you think about who are the largest renewable power buyers in America, or frankly around the world, it is these tech companies, because they need to power all these data centers. So we're seeing, you know, a combination of these forces at play. And then to your point, I think our representative from Sage will have a great insight on the CO2 side, but at least on the other oil and gas major side, Chevron's investing, Chesapeake's investing actively. And they're recognizing that, hey, look, we need to get ahead of this, at least understand what's happening, so that when these technologies are mature, we can be a product developer. That's what everyone sees, right? And they need to actually have a few bets along the way so that they don't want to miss out. And once Chevron does something or Chesapeake does something, it kind of forces everyone else to, wait, what do they know that we don't know? And that's always a positive for the industry. So at least that's my take.
Yeah, one comment I have is, because I heard you ask about power generation and synergy. So there's a company called Net Power that is using the alum cycle to use pure oxygen to burn natural gas. And it's interesting because the byproduct is hot CO2. So we want hot CO2. We have a CO2 turbine that we're developing with Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio. And we would love to have hot CO2. Right now, we use it in a closed loop system. When we bring the hot water to the surface, it goes through a heat exchanger and it heats up CO2, you know, to power the power plant. But eventually, if there's waste sources of hot CO2, we could use that to generate electricity. When CCS takes off, that's another thing that we're looking at is, you know, can we bring that hot CO2 that's been stored in the ground or in the earth to the surface, generate electricity, and then re-sequester it. So those are some of the synergies that, you know, in the future we see could be happening.
We can take one more.
Thank you. One of my pet peeves is that we seem to have a group think that everything's the grid and all electricity has to go through the grid. And we would be a lot better off if we were distributing it and dealing with it off the grid in terms of our additional generation. But along with that, to scale the geothermal, which I think is an aspect that we need to do, looking at the new gas wells that are going deeper and coming up with temperatures and pressures that they don't want to put in the pipeline and have to be dumped. That's a real opportunity to generate geothermal and other well pressure related generation that can then be distributed off grid, because it's often not in a good place for tying to the grid. Hopefully you all can encourage that. Thank you.
Well, so pardon? The question, well, can you form that as a question?
I guess the question is, do you all see enough? Do you all see enough value in that to push it?
Okay, fair enough.
We're currently looking at a demonstration project to be able to generate electricity off of that, that charges batteries that are used to operate diesel electric locomotives at zero emissions for small short line.
Yes, so there is, I'll toss it to Cindy in a minute, 'cause she has some actual experience with using existing oil and gas wells. There is intense interest from the field owners, you know, especially fields that are depleted, that are not generating revenue. Can we turn them into revenue producers with geothermal energy? It's borderline feasible in my opinion, but there really isn't much data to go on there. I will say that generally, you do point out they're getting hotter and deeper all the time, but generally they stop about where geothermal production starts as far as temperatures go. But you also have issues with well size, depending on how you're producing it. Oil and gas wells neck down as they go deeper. You need to generate 3 megawatts of geothermal energy off relatively low temperatures. You need on the order of 20 to 40,000 barrels a day of flow, which is a lot to squeeze through a smaller diameter pipe. So you've got issues like that. You've got condition issues on the well. And with that segue, let me toss it to Cindy.
Yeah, and I want to first address your comment on distributed power. So I do think there's a huge interest in distributed power, either again, microgrids for locations like data centers or military bases, you know, island grids for industrial applications. There's actually housing communities now that want to power themselves. I think there's one right outside of Austin that is actually trying to power themselves. So I think that's exciting. And I think I agree with you that as we get more distributed, then you get off the reliance of a grid that can be unreliable. But to the oil and gas, reusing oil and gas wells, Ken is spot on. For the mechanical storage that I had showed the videos of, because it's not looking for heat, we think we can reuse oil and gas wells because it doesn't. Most of the land wells are 4.5, 5, or 5.5 inch final casing sizes. Offshore, the casing sizes are larger, so you have the advantage there. The other advantage offshore is you have seawater, so you have the natural cooling. So cooling is one of the biggest parasitic loads of the system. So yeah, you can reuse wells. The other thing to think about is density of the wells. So if you've got unconventional wells where it's 7 to 8 wells on a pad, you have good well density. But like where we did our test in Starr County, it was a single well drilled on 40 acres. And so you're gonna, if you want to scale up, you're gonna have to drill more wells. So, re-entering a well that you don't necessarily know what's in it, you're not gonna know it until you re-enter it, you may shy away from it.
Okay, well, thank y'all very much for your questions and your interest.
Thank you.